예, 이어서 오늘 두 번째 기조 연설을 듣도록 하겠습니다. 애플 유니버시티의 조엘 파덜릭 전 총장님을 모시고 From Marching Backward to Marching Forward 20 Years of Lessons Learned as an Educator에 대해서 들어보도록 하겠습니다. 갖고 계신 리시버의 채널 1은 한국어, 채널 2는 영어가 되니 참고하시기 바랍니다. 예, 조엘 퍼덜리 교수님을 큰 박수로 맞이하여 주시기 바랍니다. 화장실. 파덜리 교수님이 잠깐 자리를 이석하셨다가 지금 들어오고 계십니다. 예, 큰 박수로 환영 부탁드리겠습니다.
Good afternoon. It's an honor to be here. If I start clicking, will the slides start appearing? Oh, there we go. Okay. All right. I'm Joel Podolny, CEO of Honor Education. I'd like to begin my remarks by asking you to consider the following. To close your eyes, or pretend to close your eyes, and imagine what a transformational educational learning experience looks like. Like what do you see? What do you envision? You can open your eyes now. Does it look something like this? Where you've got a teacher in front who's actively engaged, where you've got students who are focused and attentive. If what you had in your mind was something like this image, it's deeply embedded. It cuts across cultures. Whether or not here, or here, or here, this is what is in most of our minds when we envision transformational learning. Imagine you were the teacher there, who goes by the name Socrates. And imagine you had the impact on the learners, the students who were there, and had that expression on their face as you're teaching. How would you feel? I think you'd feel pretty good. I think you'd be thinking, I'm going to get good teaching ratings when this class is done. I mean, look at that guy. I mean, imagine having somebody in your class who's so excited, so motivated, that their hands are up like this. They're like pumping their fists because they are so excited about what they're learning. Or look at him. I mean, we probably would want him to have a shirt on, but look at the eyes, the way they're intensely focused. Or this individual down here who's taking notes clearly and intently for later. This is what, again, most of us think transformational education looks like. It's about activation, energizing people. It's about connection, connecting people to the learning, to the content, to one another, to the instructor. And it's about reflection, right? That's the essence of what it is to have transformational education, to really change people through and to develop them and to grow them and to enhance them in terms of how they learn. So, question is, why can't I just end my talk here and say, okay, we've just defined transformational education, talk over? What's the problem? The problem is this. There's only about 20 people in this room, or space, and if this teacher in the center wants to impact not 20, but wants to impact 200 or 2,000, the only model that we've got for transformational education requires that individual to repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat with this setup, with this group. This model, this image of transformational education, it doesn't scale. And it doesn't scale especially given the complexities of modern life, where people are increasingly looking to learn and to develop themselves and to grow in ways that are woven into work and other family demands and so on. And if it doesn't scale, it reduces the university's impact on the ecosystems of which we're a part. So how do we scale this? How do we scale that kind of transformational learning that when we close our eyes and we envision a classroom, the teacher in front, and everybody connected, how do we scale that so that universities can be more powerful contributors to that broader ecosystem? That's what I want to sort of talk about. What's the answer? I currently live in or around Silicon Valley, depends on where you draw the borders. If you were to ask sort of in Silicon Valley, okay, what's the answer to how to scale? The answer would be technology. In fact, if you're in Silicon Valley, this is almost always the answer, regardless of what the question is. And so in education, the answer becomes education technology. But how effective has this answer been? Arguably, this answer has not been very effective, because if it had been effective, we'd probably have a different mental model in our mind when asked that first question about what transformational education experience looks like. We'd have a mental model that would allow for a single teacher to have more of an impact than the 20 or 40 people that they're talking to in front of them. Now, why hasn't it succeeded? To motivate the answer to why it hasn't succeeded, I want to show you this photo. This is a photo from 1831. This is one of my favorite photos of all time. This is a photo of a rail line called the Erie-Lackawanna Rail. It was one of the first railroads in the United States. In the front of this image, you see one of the great innovations of the Industrial Revolution, the steam engine locomotive. It would galvanize so much more in terms of economic development and growth. But what makes this photo so amazing is not what's, and so important and so interesting, is not what's in front and what's in back, right? What's in back is not what we expect with a train. With a train, we expect passenger cars in the back. But these are not passenger cars. What are they? These are stagecoaches, the form of transportation that people used when they were pulled by horses, not by a steam engine locomotive. Why stagecoaches? Because we can clearly see this is a bad user experience. The soot is landing on people, right? It seems obvious to anybody today that there's a better way to have people transported than in stagecoaches when attached to a steam engine locomotive. Why couldn't people see that at the time? The answer, to invoke a line from the philosopher Marshall McLuhan, is because when it comes to innovation, so often we march backwards into the future, right? That's an example of marching backwards into the future. It would be 20 years before they would get the idea to change the design of the vehicles that were used to hold people. There's so many examples of this. The first smartphones didn't have the kind of screens that you're currently holding. They were shrunken computers. We took a keyboard and we just shrunk it to the size that could fit in your hand. So you could do an Excel spreadsheet this big, right? That's marching backwards into the future. And we've been marching backwards into the future, I would argue, with respect to education technology. In what ways have we been marching backwards into the future? Well, let's go back to this image. What's defining of this learning experience? There's three characteristics. It's synchronous. The teacher, the learners, they're all there at the same time. They're together in a moment. The second is it's in person. We're together in a moment in the same physical space. The third is it's collective, right? The most powerful learning experiences are invariably when we are brought into contact with the questioning, with the debating, with the insight that comes not just from ourselves, but from others. And that image at that time, or of that time, and the characteristics, it still applies today. It's synchronous, it's in person, it's collective. And when we've started to introduce technology to scale this, what we've done is we've switched out one of these attributes to increase scale, but we've never thought fundamentally about the learning model and how it can be different. So, when we switch out in person and have online learning, it looks just the same. When we switch out collective and have somebody learning as an individual, it's just the same. It's the same mental model. And when we switch out synchronous and have it be asynchronous with the MOOCs or massive online open enrollment courses, it's still the same. This is what marching backwards into the future looks like. And by the way, this isn't to be critical of anybody. Turning around and sort of starting to march forward is a collective effort, and it requires time and reflection, and sometimes a little bit of luck. And in some ways, you don't even know if you're marching forwards until 20 years later. Now, what's the alternative? To answer that, I want to sort of take you a little bit on my journey, a journey of about the last 20 or so years. And it's a journey with, you could call them happy accidents or unintended discoveries. And I'd like to use that as a way to offer you a hypothesis on what that difference could be. The journey starts here. This is the Yale School of Management, where I was dean for a number of years. Of course, when I was there, it didn't look like this. It looked like this. That was my office over on the one side there. Still a nice building, but a little humbler. And one of the more important, at least for me, initiatives that happened during my tenure as dean was that the faculty shifted the MBA curriculum from one in the first year that relied on the functions, the disciplines as the core of the MBA curriculum, to one where the stakeholders that a manager needs to engage with in order to be effective to define the classes that would be the core of the curriculum. This was the visual that we used to represent it at that time. So instead of a course in finance, you have a course on the investor. Instead of a course in marketing, you have a course on the customer. Instead of a course in organizational behavior, you have a course on the employee. Now, it can be pretty tempting, especially the way I introduced it, to start, sort of asking, well, is that just sort of old wine in new bottles? Just a relabeling? Well, what motivated and defined this shift was the belief that there's no problem that arises in an organization, there's no problem that arises in a business that is defined by our disciplines, right? Whether or not we're a professor of organizational behavior or finance, no manager gets up in the morning and says, oh, I just have a finance problem today. If they have a finance problem, they have problems probably with employees and so on. A simple example, think about how organizations fall out of alignment with their customer. In the disciplinary approach to an MBA curriculum, it's invariably marketing that talks about the customer. I taught organizational behavior for many years. I almost never talked about the customer, despite the fact that if an organization falls out of alignment with its customer, it could be that it's a marketing issue, but it could be that it's an organizational design issue, or it could be an incentive issue, or it could be an accounting issue. Every discipline has something to contribute to why an organization might no longer be aligned with its customer. And so, as a result, every discipline has something to contribute to that manager in terms of how they can better get that alignment. But we're not going to get those disciplines together if they're teaching in their disciplinary silos. And that was the basic idea behind the curriculum, to create these multidisciplinary courses taught by multiple faculty. But here was absolutely the challenge that hit all of us who were teaching in it, which is, if you've written business cases, as many of you have, it's really hard to write a case that isn't from your own disciplinary perspective, because this is the view we have, this is the training that we have. And so when I started bringing these multidisciplinary faculty together, you'd have these cases at least when we started, that they were disorganized, they were chaotic, because you're trying to just bring all these different disciplines together. So the happy accident of a solution to that problem was the faculty decided in many cases, instead of writing a case, let's just give the students the raw material. Let's just give them all the artifacts that we look at when we write the case. Let's give them the video clips. Let's give them the newspaper articles. Let's give them the interviews. And let's just have them go at it. Here's one example. Without going into the details, because they're not that important, one of the earliest cases was on a leverage buyout of a real estate investment trust. And the students had to figure out the price that was paid for this real estate investment trust. Was it too high or was it too low? They had to think about a whole lot of things, from leadership to finance issues to organizational issues. They even had to think about architectural issues. How much is a beautiful building worth versus a not beautiful building worth? And one of the raw artifacts that we introduced was this one. We used Google Earth to show them where every building that was owned by that real estate investment trust was located and what that building looked like, because unless you saw it, you didn't realize that this real estate investment trust had the strategy of buying the least nice house on a really, really nice block. So 1740 Broadway is a skyscraper in one of the most expensive areas of real estate, certainly in the United States, if not the world, in Manhattan. But it's not that attractive of a building, but you don't know that until you see it. So for this case, we gave the students about 1,000 pages of reading. We gave them about an hour of video, and we gave them this, and we said, did they pay the right price? And for students who complained about reading a 20-page case because it was too long, they loved this. They got to be detectives, going through 1,000 pages. And for us, it led to a distinction between what we called sort of the cooked case, which we're all very familiar with, and what this was, which was a raw case. It was the raw artifacts. So that was sort of discovery number one, which is one way to change how to think about teaching is to begin with the learning artifact. Don't separate the students from those raw artifacts that you use for generating your ideas about what you teach. And I took that idea of beginning with learning artifacts to Apple when I became dean of Apple University. And it was so helpful for giving clarity and substance to what would otherwise be a very vague idea. Here's a simple example. One of the things that Apple takes very seriously in its design and engineering is the importance of putting feelings first, feelings before function, when you think about design and engineering. Now you can hear that statement, you can think, oh, Apple wants their users to be happy. Sure. Or you can show them this learning artifact, which is an incredible puzzle. This is an ad from 1984 when Apple introduced the original Macintosh. This is a print ad, so it cost real money every time it got printed up. And while it may not look odd if you think about this ad, and in particular, you think about the image of the hand in the handle, it's a really odd thing to spend money to show. Because what made the Macintosh was a graphical user interface. They're showing a blank screen. And this is not a portable computer. You don't carry your Macintosh around. You put it on a desk. It's a desktop machine. It's going to sit in the same place for 99% of the time that it is owned. So why show the hand in the handle on the top? Why even have the handle on the top? The answer is this: it has no functional value. What you're trying to signal to the user, who are the rest of us, who have never used a computer in our life in 1984, what you're trying to signal is you can handle me. That's it. That's the whole reason for being there. So you show an artifact like that, and all of a sudden it gives way more meaning and purpose to that idea of putting feeling first than the broad statement. So now we get to April 2020. I built the university around this focus on learning artifacts and creating engagement in classes around it. But now COVID hits, and now learning looks like this, and engagement looks like this, where you've got these discussion boards on the side, and the learning artifact sort of is no longer where people's attention is, right? It's been decentered. And all of a sudden, instead of people talking in a very detailed way about like an image like we just saw, they're talking in very broad and vague ways about did they like the book or not like the book? Did they think that the article was interesting? And it created a question that then has led to where I am today, which is CEO of Honor Education, trying to essentially solve this problem. How do we enable shared and remote asynchronous exploration around learning artifacts that's transformational in the same way that collective in-person learning is? It's essentially saying, how can we start to march forward into the future, not have that collective learning model in the background? So I'm going to talk about two things, and there's like different solutions that could be proposed. I'll talk about the ones that, like at my company, we've been focusing on, but it's, you know, there obviously are a lot of others. The first is how to bring faculty commentary around learning artifacts, and the second is how to bring those student reactions that we saw, like in that image of Socrates surrounded by all the nobles as they're sort of learning. How can we create that level of reaction? So the commentary one is like in some ways easy. You know, you can, instead of thinking about discussion boards on the side, it's thinking about how do we start using a digital platform so that the learning artifacts become the base, become the foundation, allowing faculty to, instead of putting comments in a discussion board, to put like an audio note on an image or at a particular equation in a particular piece of text. That one's easy. The harder one is how do you have a really fast and fluid way for students to react like they do when they're in a room? Because you could have, just like you have comments that readers of a paper will make at the end of an article, you can have people type comments, but it doesn't have that like fast and interactive way of reacting. And what my design team did, and again, it's not the only solution one could come up with, but it's one, and hopefully it's one that's interesting or provocative, is they went back to what we know about highlighting and how it contributes to learning. And if any of you are experts in learning research or learning theory, you know there's a lot of research that shows that highlighting doesn't improve learning outcomes. It's a very robust finding. The reason highlighting doesn't improve learning is because it's too passive, it's too automatic. People want to be intentional when they highlight and have it be something like this, but this lasts for about 20 minutes. And then after a while, people are just, kind of moving with one color. And that's true with physical highlighting, it's true with digital highlighting. It's too passive of an activity. When you take a physical note, when you write it in the notebook, you get muscle memory attached to seeing something that commits it to memory. And so what my design team started to focus on was, how do we have just a little bit more intentionality in reacting? How do we have a little bit more of a prompt for people to essentially make a mental note in a way that starts to elevate the engagement without the technology getting in the way of where you want them focused, which is around the learning artifact, whether or not it's an image or a book or a video or whatever it is. And the way that designers will do that is they'll do it by giving a set of prompts. And it needs to be a relatively short list of prompts, because if it's a list of 100 prompts, it's too many to go through. And so what the team did was they spent a lot of time researching, why do people highlight? It turns out there are no dissertations that have ever been written on when people highlight, why do they highlight? I know that's hard to believe, but it turns out, at least we were unable to find them. And so they did a lot of research on it, and turns out that there's basically 4 reasons. The first and base case is because it's important, midterm, final, job, career, you name it. Second is, who cares if it's important? It's so interesting, I want it saved in my digital notebook. The third is, I don't get it, it's unclear. And the fourth is, I get it, but I still got questions because I'm not sure I agree with it. It's debatable. And underlying these 4 ways of reacting are, and it's why I think we felt like we were pretty comfortable that again, there's edge cases, but we got most of the actual cases, is there's a nice 2-dimensional typology underlying this. The first dimension is between reacting or highlighting that's declarative. This is important. This is interesting. Versus interrogative, a question. I don't get it, or I've got questions about it because I'm not sure I agree with it. The second dimension is from comprehension, so understanding. I either understand it's important or I don't understand at all. To it's emotionally provoking, it's inspirational, whether or not that's in a positive way, like it's interesting, or in a negative way, like it's debatable. And if all of a sudden you've got these 4 ways to prompt somebody on when they're reacting to material, now you're starting to always lead them to ask for themselves, why am I highlighting? And with that, now imagine being a student, and you could be looking at an image, or you could be going through a video, or you could be reading an article. And now instead of, a whole lot of typing or whatnot, with 2 quick taps, it's like, why am I highlighting? Because it's interesting. And if I want to make a note, sure, fine. I can make an audio note or a text note. I can save it to my notebook. But the other thing is, because these colors have meaning, all of a sudden, we can start to organize how everybody in the class is reacting. And we can even do this on a phone, not on a computer. And because those colors have meaning, now imagine like on this screen, if I'm going through this and I'm reading, it's the same experience of being in a room where like I can look at, are people nodding? Are they leaning forward? Blue is important, green is interesting. So it's saying like others regard this as important at the same time that I'm going through it. And imagine the bars continuing to go further down and have that. And so now all of a sudden we've given people a lightweight way to engage around the content where instead of having a discussion board on the side, we've brought it together around that artifact that was at that core. And you can even have, again, you know, like the commentary of the instructor there as well. And again, there are other ways to do this, but this was one way that we thought about, trying to shift from marching backwards by regarding synchronous, in-person, and collective as sort of the only model of what engaging transformational learning can look like, where then the alternative, it's either synchronous or asynchronous, or it's in-person or it's online, or it's collective or individual. If now you put the learning artifact in the center, you don't have these trade-offs anymore. If you think about the individual on that learning journey through the video, through the text, through the audio, through the graph, through something on the web, and then we've got that faculty commentary being added at all the different locations. And we can have live classes woven in. But when those live classes are woven in, those aren't the only times in which people are engaging with one another because they're seeing simultaneously the reactions of others as they're going through the text. So all this alternation between I study alone and then I come back together with individuals, we're always together. This is at least an attempt at a different mental model, an attempt to sort of shift that backward-looking imagery of keep trying to use technology to basically replicate the classroom to can we use the technology to create a different way of learning that doesn't force these trade-offs. Now, my guess is when I asked that question in the beginning, what's your mental model of transformational education, and you close your eyes, you didn't see this. If anybody saw this, please come up afterwards. I would love to meet you. But the idea that this type of image could provide sort of a different model and a different way to scale, I guess I would offer that to you just for your thoughts and considerations. So, because I'll end with basically 3 conclusions. In my view, what's really changed over the last 20 years is the easy access to meaningful raw learning facts that can inspire and engage. Right? 20 years ago, boy, how hard was it to get, a great copy of an ad or a video or whatnot. I mean, we can get anything in front of our students now. So, given that, how do we take that advantage of that and start thinking about how we change how we teach so that that new power of having those learning artifacts becomes central to the learning? And then to the degree to which we leverage technology, not just for remote, but asynchronous engagement, that's going to enable the scaling of transformational education. Because if you could really create engagement asynchronously that was as powerful as the engagement synchronously, you change the thing that hasn't changed in education in thousands of years, which is the scale economies at which it operates. right? Because you could change the time that a faculty member needs to be with their students. You could change the requirement on the students to always be co-present with the teacher and with others to have a really transformational learning experience. I mean, think about that. What other industry do you know anywhere near the size of education where the scale economies have never changed? Right? That's what we need to do if we're going to enhance the impact of universities on those ecosystems. The only way we can enhance it is by scaling, and the only way we can scale is by not using that model of in-person learning as what we're constantly trying to replicate as we scale, as we leverage technology. Anyway, those are some thoughts. It's absolutely been an honor. Thank you.
예, 파들리 교수님의 강연이었습니다. 이어서 연세대학교 이무원 교수님과 파들리 교수님께서 같이 Q&A를 우리 플로어에 계신 분들하고 갖는 시간을 가지려고 합니다. 잠시 자리를 정돈한 동안 기다려 주십시오. 네, 계속해서 연세대학교의 이무원 교수님과 파들리 교수님께서 몇 가지 대담 형식으로 여기 계신 분들과 소통하면서 질의응답을 갖도록 하겠습니다. 좀 이따가 궁금하신 사항을 직접 질문하실 수 있도록 저희가 마이크도 준비하고 있으니까요. 기다려주시고 그러면 진행을 이무원 교수님께 부탁을 드리겠습니다.
네, 감사합니다. Thank you so much, Joel, for your insightful and informative presentation.
Thank you.
And so, since we are running out of time, let me directly ask you a few questions on some part in your speech. The first question I'd like to ask you about is about the inertial forces the universities will experience in their scaling of transformational education. So the solution, I think that is a tentative solution. You suggest definitely require totally new forms of educational models, including new pedagogic methods, new curricula, even new criteria for faculty members' promotion and compensation. Mm-hmm. But we all know it is not an easy job.
No.
So, so do you think what would be the most important task in such challenging transitions?
So I know I'm speaking, a lot of faculty here. I mean, I go back in some ways to that statement about the same way Apple thinks about the emotion around the use is I think we need to think, and this was certainly like when I led that curriculum reform at Yale, I think we need to think about the emotional stress that we put on the teachers who are going to be part of that change, and then think about how we support them through that, right? So, like when I was, again, you can imagine it was sort of a big deal for faculty to give up teaching their disciplinary course and say, now I'm going to teach in a multidisciplinary setting. And I remember when I was dean, a big focus of mine was on how do I just make sure that they feel supported, not just from the point of view of like, I'm with it, I'm teaching as well, but really thinking hard about what are the things that they need in place. If, to use the example of the learning artifacts, what are the tools that we're giving faculty to make it not just possible to teach in a new way, but actually enjoyable to teach in a new way, to make it fun to teach in a new way. And I feel if you can focus on that, like what would make it fun to teach in a new way, then you start to make the change. But I think so often when we're leading the change, we sort of focus on trying to sell the outcome as opposed to thinking hard about how do we make it as positive as an experience as it can be. And in any case, that's I mean, obviously there are specifics we would want to focus on because there are a lot of inertial forces. But I think at the end of the day, if you can make it so that people feel that the journey is going to be an exciting one, it's going to be an interesting one, it's going to be an inspirational one, they'll be along for the ride.
The reason I asked that question is related to the identity issue of universities. So I fully agree that the university should be a key player in ecosystem through the transformation of their education. But I also know there is some voice that the university needs to have some distance from the outsiders to maintain their the accountability and the reliability of their original mission. So can you think that the scaling of the transformational education have some impact on striking an appropriate balance in that issue?
That's a great question. And I feel that issue that you're pointing to is one I've like always wrestled with. Like when I was at Apple University, it was even more of an issue in a corporate university is around the distance. And I remember Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, we would talk about that issue of distance because one of the things that I would convey is if people felt that the university wasn't a space to wrestle and challenge ideas, even ideas that were coming from management, then we would lose credibility, and then people wouldn't articulate their worries, their concerns. And I remember Tim one time saying, and he would use this metaphor after that many times. He'd say, you want the universities, and I think this is probably the case with the ecosystem, you want the universities to be like journalists on a paper, right? They should hopefully love the paper. They should want it to be successful. They should want to work hard so that it is successful. But if ever management is saying, I want you to write the end of your story this way rather than this way because it'll sell more papers, all of a sudden it undercuts what people are expecting from the paper. And I would like to believe that if you made it possible for people to scale more effectively, you could take off some of the cost pressures on the universities in ways that would make it easier to maintain that balance. Because I think one of the things that gets in the way of maintaining that balance is the cost pressures.
Yeah. I think the related to ecosystem, I like your conclusion that universities need to increase their impact on ecosystem by scaling the transformational education. To do that, it seems also very critical for the university to achieve new forms of relationship with other players in the ecosystem, especially companies and the central and the local government. And do you have any ideal directions for those relationships, or are there any good examples you have observed?
Again, another good question. This may not be a great answer, but I do think that focusing on the learning artifact first, and being curious. Like that image that I showed of the Macintosh. Like I remember really seeing that and puzzling over it. And then the only way I could get an answer to it was to go talk to the leading designers at Apple and say, like, why did you put a handle on the top of a computer that's never going to move? And they said, you're thinking about it wrong, Joel. It's not functional. It's emotional. And if instead I had started with like what I wanted to teach, and then started assembling, data and examples, and as opposed to looking, and so to bring that answer now back to your question, I think that approach of finding artifacts, being curious, I think that creates an alignment between the universities, the corporations, the government, because ultimately there's the ones who are the holders of so many of those artifacts, right? Whether or not it's a product, a story, a schematic of some kind, it creates that alignment and a basis for that questioning. It makes it easier to be curious than to come with a already established mindset. And I think that leads to better partnership.
Thank you. Actually, I have one more question, and I'll pass on the mic to you, the floor. The last question is actually come from my personal curiosity, and you put in synchronous and asynchronous, and the collective, individual, in person, and online, and what would be the relationship between online versus in-person communication and people's innovative performance? According to a recent research report that was posted on Stanford Business School's website, the working at home enhances the performance of very routinized jobs, but can decrease the performance for the jobs that require imagination and the creative capability. Do you think an effective leveraging of technology can address that issue?
So to channel somebody who I know means a lot to you and me, Jim March, serendipity, good fortune, luck, is important to creativity. The problem with Zoom meetings and just remote learning is we don't bump into each other and create that opportunity for serendipity, right? I think there's no way we can get to where it's like going to always be fully remote if that's important to the creativity. Having said that, I would go back to that distinction I drew between being able, as you would be reading something and you would be commenting on what's important or what's interesting and maybe make a comment, if I can see that as I'm reading, I think that is very different than you and I being remotely and then posting on a discussion board. So I'd like to think we can do better than teleconferencing software for enabling creative interactions. But it obviously can't be only that.
Yeah. Also, that's a very challenging job, actually.
It is,
challenging design.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, that's from my question, my part. And 혹시 플로어에서 혹시 질문 있으신 분 계실까요? 없나?
Well, I'm very thankful to all of you, both of you, for making presentation and discussion. And the very last part, that is serendipity. I think the word serendipity is very important in creating the creativity. And then you said that in the remote communication, serendipity may have a certain limitation, which we fully understand. But at the same time, when we have remote communication, we can have access to the people who we will never have access to if we use only face-to-face communication. So, in one hand, when we have remote communication through internet, serendipity itself will be maybe jeopardized, but at the same time, we may enhance the opportunity to have more serendipity from our encounter with the people who we will never have access to if we did not have internet communication. So I think the serendipity can both way. So I guess it depends on how we effectively use remote communication.
I think you said that so well. I don't even want to say anything because you said it so well. I completely agree. I think the only thing I would add is that's precisely why if we framed the challenge of, can you imagine a way of designing learning so you don't have to have the trade-off between online and in-person and asynchronous and synchronous and collective and individual? If you don't, instead of choosing, but allow for moving fluidly between them, then you should get those benefits, right? And so you get the serendipity of the accidental interaction in person, but you also get the serendipity of getting access to some thought, some idea from somebody in some part of the world that I never would have been in touch with, right? And the problem is, I think we've been locked into, I'm going to choose modality, I'm going to choose one or the other, and how do we think about designing learning so that we don't have to choose? Yeah.
So you think the probably multiple combination of leveraging technology, we are more likely to obtain serendipity in some sense. Right?
Yeah, I would think so.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, I think
Stanford should do that study.
yeah. So I think that's very good research topic. So my future study. Okay, I think it's time up. So I think we should wrap up right now. And thanks again, Joel. And I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts. And I think I'm pretty sure my friends and my colleagues here are all of the same mind. So everybody, could you please give a big hand to Joel Podolly?
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Thank you. It's been a real honor. Thank you.
저 조엘 파들리 교수님하고 이무현 교수님 감사드립니다. 유익하고 감명 깊은 시간이었습니다. 두 분께 다시 한번 박수 한번 부탁드리겠습니다. 지금까지 개막식 및 기조연설, 최우량 기업대상 시상식까지 함께해 주신 여러분께 감사드립니다. 4시 20분부터 맞은편 325, 326호에서 장순웅 국가교육위원회 중장기 국가교육발전전문위원회 위원장님의 발표와 이기봉 대학교육협의회 사무총장님, 키요시 야마다 일본 동해대학교 전 총장님, 제프 페리 ASSB 부원장님, 문영구 고령대학교 교수님께서 패널로 참여하시는 고등교육 혁신과 지역 혁신 섹션을 진행하오니 많은 참여를 부탁드리겠습니다. 또 참여자께서는 1만 원권 상당의 기부 특권이 진행되니 입장 시에 QR코드 스캔을 하시면 감사하겠습니다. 또 아울러 본 행사에 들어오실 때 받으신 교환권의 도장을 받으시면 행사 기간 동안 플리츠마 가방 선물로 교환해 드리니 꼭 기간 내에 받아가시기 바랍니다. 장시간 동안 본 행사에 참여해 주신 여러분들께 감사의 말씀드립니다. 이상으로 행사를 마치도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다.